We're talking about a business that I have passed on, even though it's trading at five times earnings and it's growing. This business is Park Dental Partners. I'm going to go through the reasoning as to why I found it interesting to begin with, and then ultimately the reason I ended up selling, not selling, but not buying. And it's not going to be what you think, actually. Not to say that there isn't an opportunity to make money on this opportunity, it's just a pass for me. But I just thought I'd sort of share the rationale and sort of my thought process as I'm going through this business. So I'll get into the start of it. Ultimately, I found this business very interesting from an investment perspective because it was trading very cheap. So actually, it's gone up a fair bit since I've looked at it a couple of days back. At the time, it was trading about 4.5, 5 times earnings. So I mean, it's still within that range, more or less. So very cheap for any sort of US business, really. So that's going to catch your eye first thing, right? So I mean, most businesses nowadays in the US are trading at 20 times earnings. Even if you say, this is a micro cap business, so perhaps it should trade a bit cheaper. Even if you say 10, 15 times earnings, this is still very cheap, right? And this business is actually a dental roll up. So if you've not sort of guessed by the name, basically what they do is they run a bunch of dentist offices and they just buy up dentist offices and then just continue to grow that way. They take on debt, expand, pay off that debt a bit, and then they keep expanding and they keep the cycle going basically. And these businesses can scale very well. Whilst they are heavy on the balance sheet, like that, you can do very well off them, particularly if they're well run by strong management, and if they're bought at healthy multiples as well. So ultimately caught my eye. I mean, just on multiple alone, you could see this trading at 10, 12 times earnings. I mean, a lot of their peers, whilst they are obviously bigger than Park Dental, perhaps that $1 billion market cap range, a lot of them are trading at like 15 to 20 times earnings. So, just on multiple alone, if this business continues expanding, my thinking was that there's going to be a lot of room for upside. And ultimately ended up passing because I started looking at sort of the quality of the business when looking at the filings, and actually because this business has literally just listed like 4 days ago, well, six days ago now. It's very early. Normally, I wouldn't look at IPOs, but this one just happened to catch my eye because of valuation. I thought, okay, this industry generally, there've been a few successful players. Let me have a look. And what I ended up stumbling into was their filing, which ultimately basically just gave you a lot of detail on the business. There's like their investor presentation that they've put together. And one of the first things, so I'm just flicking through this investor presentation, and one of the first things I see is this statistic that really pops out to me, which is patient retention rate. I'm thinking, wow, that's phenomenal. You know, nearly 90% patient retention rate. And the reason this is so important as well is because it's a very good statistic to get you an understanding of how well it's operated in terms of, are people, what's the experience like in the actual dentist itself? Are people wanting to actively come back? Are the contracts very sticky? It's a very quick way to give you a snapshot glance as to how well the business is operating relative to competitors, right? So I'm thinking, I'm doing a bit of research. I can see that if you're getting anywhere beyond 80% plus, you're generally doing very well. Um, Sort of anywhere between 85% plus, really, you start doing quite well for yourself. In this industry, you'd be above average for sure. Nearly 90% is hitting phenomenal levels, right? So I'm like, wow, that's very strong. But this is sort of where my perspective started to change a bit, started to shift because as any great investor will know, or any investor will know, that oftentimes the most important details are in the footnotes. So I'm not sure if you can see that little bit of text just in the bottom left corner, just in the black there, notes 1 to 4, and these are actually in relation to these massive statistics. So I am just going to zoom in now. Let's have a quick read. So you'll be able to see across the side here we have the 89.7% retention rate. And what you will also see are these footnotes. So I'm just going to show you. So there's a second footnote in relation to retention rate. I'm like, okay, let me read the second retention rate. Footnote, just so on the off chance that there's anything wrong, I can get better understanding. So just going to go through that now for you. So patient retention rate is defined as the percentage of patients who remain active patients compared to 1 year period for the 6 months ended the 6th to the 30th, 2025. So to me, there's nothing that's unsuspicious about it. Perhaps you could say, well, why are they only doing it on a 6 month period? For the 6 month ended, why are they only doing it like midway through the year? Could they be potentially cherry picking? But no, it's probably just because they're only halfway through the year. And that's sort of the most recent information they have. So I'm not too concerned about that. And actually, it was more or less reading a different statistic, which I'm going to pull up now. So read through that statistic, and then I was like, okay, let me just read this second statistic as well and understand a bit more about this one. So 330,000 active patients in 2024. I'm like, okay, let me read through that. And now this is where things are really interesting because, again, for a bit of context here, this statistic, the 89.7% retention rate, is a key crutch that the management used throughout the whole presentation multiple times. Basically, it's the crux of their thesis for why you should invest in this company. And what you will see is active patients are defined as general dentistry patients. So far, nothing out of the normal. Okay, fine. But this is where it starts to really get interesting. Having been seen by our affiliated dental practices within the past 36 months. Those of you who don't know, in general, in the dentistry industry, the the normal statistic used is 18 months. That's how you define an active patient, someone that's been with you for 18 months. Because 36 months is 3 whole years. So what that means is someone could have attended in 2022 and just not turned up whatsoever up until, from up until 2022, and they would still be classed as an active patient when clearly they have long gone left for somewhere else. Perhaps they moved house, perhaps they've just had a horrible experience and want to go somewhere else, right? And then you've got sort of the second half, which is all last 18 months for patients under age of 18. And you may think, okay, well, that's fairly reasonable. Only the adults are slightly higher. The children are still still within the standard 18-month range, right? But not really, because when you think about it, children are going to be if we just think about this from a product perspective, children are going to be a much stickier customers. It's much more likely they're going to remain with the dentist that's local to them, unlike sort of adults who, they, especially if they don't have children, they're more likely to move. So this is going to be a much more significant amount of the population as well. So if you sort of take into account that fact, what you will actually find is that, oh, actually, the dentists are just measuring the statistic completely different compared to the rest of the industry. So you can't really compare apples for apples here because it's just going to completely skew with the statistics that are provided. So you don't really have a benchmark here. And the issue as well here is because they do it on a 36-month basis, it's very difficult to see what's happened in those 3 years. It might just be actually year 2022 they did very poorly, and actually they've been doing better since. But chances are, I think the reason behind using this statistic is because I bet you whenever they have acquisitions, they will see a significant drop off in the amount of customers there because I think, frankly, the quality of the service drops as well as the quality of the actual expertise in the business drops. And this isn't necessarily brand new information for dentist roll-ups. I think it has been fairly common knowledge, but I think just the management here just isn't as strong. And I think, frankly, I'm not quite sure, but they've not quite got the same level of retention, and that's what I'm really concerned about, particularly as they go into such depth to hide this key point. So we're going to then go through some sort of other pieces, and I'm not just basing my thesis on this, not the thesis, but not basing my commentary just on this one piece. There are other things as well. So I'm just going to go through a few other sort of points here. So, sort of a second point that I'm going to make on here, if I just zoom out a sec, let's just have a quick look. So, one of the things about the industry is that obviously, roll-ups use a lot of debt by nature, because it's either, if you're going to raise lots of money, it's either you use your profits, which they are already doing, but because they need so much, profits aren't going to be enough to cover the acquisition cost. So you've got your profits. So what else are you left with? Realistically, it's loans or it's diluting capital. At current valuations, doesn't really make sense to dilute capital. And frankly, most investors don't like diluting capital, because obviously, why would you want your stake to be diluted? So oftentimes what ends up happening is debt gets taken on, and that's what can be seen here. So if we look at this balance sheet, we can see that the total assets, all the assets they own, are worth, if we round it up, $150 million. The total liabilities, on the other hand, is worth $155 million. Again, I'm going to round it up slightly for round numbers' sake. $155 million. So what that tells you instantly is that the total debt is greater than the total assets, which is never a great sign, because it just means the balance sheet is quite levered, especially because a lot of this debt, a lot of the assets on the balance sheet aren't actual assets you can really sell unless you plan on selling the business itself. So what I mean by that is, for example, you have goodwill and intangibles. So this is basically just going to be the namesake, so it's the brand value itself that they ascribe to the brand value of the dentist, or the reputation, or the customer client list. And this is very hard to track, and also it's not something you can actively sell if if let's say times get tough, you need to raise money. It's not something you can actively sell unless you plan on selling the business itself. So that I've got an issue with that, because ultimately, you're already in a high debt load position, which again is nothing out of the ordinary for roll-ups, but all it just means is that that does show that, frankly, to get to that position where you have so much debt, you have had to have done a fair bit of acquisitions to get to sort of this position, particularly as this business has been running for 10 plus, a lot more than 10 plus years now, right? So we would have had chance to sort of pay off that debt as it's continued to grow, and yet it's still got a significant amount of debt. So this shows that they've been very active in acquisitions, which again sort of leads me on to my next point that I'm trying to make in relation to this, which is the fact that when you consider all these acquisitions they are doing, you can actually see that their growth has been fairly limited for the scale that the business is sort of acquiring on. And what I actually mean by that is, so if we look from here, you can see that basically over the last decade, whilst they have grown 8% a year for 11 years, if you actually look from 2013 to 2014, they grew 21%. So that drives up the statistic a lot. When you actually average it out, excluding that 1 year, which is probably, I wouldn't be surprised if that was cherry picked. But let's just say we just use the last 10 years rather than 11, just to normalize it. You actually get 7% a year return. And whilst that sounds, fairly good, but you have to take into account, well, actually, if this business is able to acquire other businesses at a very cheap price, and inflation has occurred, and they should be able to increase prices over time, why is this business only grown 7%? And this is my sort of thinking behind this, is that I think that this business has a leaky bucket problem. And what I mean by that is that essentially any sort of businesses they acquire, their service goes down, they lose customers as a result. You can see this in lots of different forms. I'm going to go through some other sort of data points in a second as well that cover this, but I think the issue here is that the quality of the offering has obviously dropped a lot. The expertise and the expertise in-house, but also the delivery has fallen, and as a result, whilst you do acquire these businesses, you're churning over customers fairly significantly, and I think that's like a fundamental issue with the business. Not to say again that as an investor, you couldn't make money in this opportunity, but to me, this seems like a low quality run business potentially. It's either an issue. It's hard to tell, but it could, especially when there's so limited information considering it's just listed. But it seems to either be a management thing, or it seems to be the fact that actually this business just hasn't got its model sorted. I'm not quite sure what's prevent. There's definitely something in place there that is stopping the business from consistently being able to keep its customers at a high level and having to mask how many customers they're actually keeping year on year. To me, that's the very concerning part. So the fact that for me they're only growing 7% when you take into account the sheer volume of acquisitions they've been doing, which we know because of looking at their balance sheet, when you consider the significant price increases over the last 10 years. I mean, I don't know about you, but pretty much everything I bought in the last 10 years has doubled in price. Like any name, sort of any item that you would have bought 10 years ago would probably be twice the price today. So to me, that the fact that it's only grown 7% a year isn't all that significant. In fact, it just seems like it's basically pretty much stayed in line, especially when you, like I say, consider the volume of acquisitions they've done. They've more than sort of doubled their store count, and it's a very significant number. I mean, even on there, it shows you that they've done 40 acquisitions. So to me, again, I'm sort of drilling home that point. I just think they're struggling to keep their customers, and that's something that they're really hiding at the minute. If you then look through some other data points, so I'll give you another example. If we look through, so I think this screen was meant to highlight the fact that actually their revenues have been growing because they have done an acquisition in 2025. So you will see from first half 2024 it's 118 million. Now it's 122 million in first half 2025. So yes, it's an increase, right? But the issue here I find is that generally in the dentistry industry, the second half of the year has always got more demand because there's a few reasons. So particularly in America, where you have your insurance policy benefits, your work benefits, right? For your dentist checkups, a lot of you basically get a surge of customers, especially towards the last quarter of the year, where basically they start utilizing their benefits because they don't want it to go to waste for the year. Otherwise, it'll expire, and basically that right they had to use the dentist for a checkup or whatever it may be has now expired, right? So I think the fact that not only has this business not grown during that period, it's actually shrunk, to me is a very concerning sign. Now, you may say this is one-offs, but again, I'm sort of what I'm looking at from my perspective is I'm piecing all the little one-offs together, and this is sort of where I'm forming my judgment. Again, this is some of my own thinking and my own thoughts here. And I'm not saying that you can't make any money on this business either because it's at such a low valuation, but I'm saying this is where the quality for me is starting to get a bit concerning, and whether the growth is actually there versus what they're showing. So I'm just going to go through a few more examples here. So another thing that I want you to take into account when they're doing these acquisitions as well is like, well, what price earnings are they paying? Right? What valuation are they paying realistically? And here they actually give us a very good example as to realistic amounts in terms of what they should realistically be paying in terms of these acquisitions, right? So I'll give you an example. So most of their acquisitions are going to be in that small practice to large practice range, because frankly, you can tell based on the volume of acquisitions they've done and based on their balance sheet. So if we know they've got $150 million of debt on their balance sheet and they've done 40 acquisitions, 150 million divided by 40 is about, call it 3.5 million per acquisition. So it's basically a mix between small practices and large practices in terms of those acquisitions. So you can rule out the enterprise practices for now. So basically, on average, you can say they're paying about 6 times EBITDA for their acquisitions. Again, based on sort of these multiples that they provided in the bottom right corner. Let's zoom into that as well, so we've got a bit more visibility. There we go. Okay. So So if we know they're paying 6 times EBITDA, which just means earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization, that to me means that, realistically, when you include, now it's not necessarily black and white, because EBITDA does include, frankly, bullshit, which is stuff like interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. They should all realistically be counted, and frankly, I'm not the biggest fan of the metric. But even if we were to overgeneralize and say 10 to 12 times actual earnings is what they take home, you very quickly get to a yield that basically, if you're paying 10 times earnings for something, you're effectively getting a 10% return on your capital. And because of that, that basically means that you should realistically be growing your business between 10%. You should be able to scale your business 10% a year if you just reinvest your profits. Never mind if you increase your debt on your balance sheet, which is what this business has been doing, right? Especially if they, do any of these fancy structures where they defer their payments, so they delay the payments, so they're able to get a little bit more out of their sort of money. Sorry, a little bit more out of their investment in terms of the return on capital. And this, even if you say, even if it's like more like, okay, it's more like, I use 10 times as well on the high range, right? If it's 8 times, it should be a 12% return on capital. And again, that's not even including debt. That's just assuming they reinvest all their profit, no debt, which they are using debt. That's something we've established. So realistically, should be higher than this. So realistically, just on acquisitions alone, we know this business. If everything else just stayed flat, which it's never going to in an ideal world, it's never going to. But even if just everything stayed flat, this business should technically be growing 10 to 12% per year, and slightly more when you consider debt as well. Now, what I will say here is that this is actually seen by peers. A lot of peers are, especially some of the bigger players, they have managed to grow at 12, 10% a year historically for like decades, right? But the fact that this business is only growing 7% and it's at a smaller scale where it's able to afford better valuations, right? They're paying 6 times EBITDA, whereas some of these bigger competitors likely are going to be paying 8 times EBITDA because they're actually doing these enterprise practice deals more so, which are obviously going to be at higher valuations, and yet they're still growing faster. So my point here is that there seems to be something wrong with their retention, and these are all sort of red flags that are sort of pointing in this direction for me. And then if you sort of, if we sort of take a step back and say, well, what are the issues? So one of the things I did do was they had a credit report, a financing sort of report that they've done as part of their S1 filing that they've updated. And this S1 filing actually gave you the list of all their locations on there. So it gave you basically the addresses and what the locations were called. And I've just stuck this into basically Claude, just like ChatGPT, and it's given me direct links to basically Google Maps. So I'm able to view all these dentists, right? I think there's 68 off the top of my head. And just going through some of the reviews, you're able to very quickly, especially if you filter through the newest reviews, you can start to really get a sense for what is starting to go on here. And I've read through a few. I'm also going to attach the PDF in the comments for you to view as well. You can click on the Google Maps, it'll just save you time. Just go through each location if this is something you're interested in more, and you're able to sort of view the Google Maps reviews, especially if you filter by newest. So this is actually an example. One of the first ones I saw actually on a. So this is one of their Park Dental offices that they bought and then rebranded. Let me just pull it up now. And more interestingly than the location itself is actually the Google Map reviews on the left-hand side. This is sort of where all the golden nuggets lie. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in on those a bit. We go to reviews. And if we go to, here we go. if we go to filter by the newest reviews. So what you will see are two key points here, and this is something I've observed in the other ones as well. Now I must say there are like a couple good locations which are still well run, but this is I'm sort of looking at to try and understand what's going on across the board. Are there any particular trends? And in this instance, it's actually very easy to identify because there's only 68 locations. It's not like it's got thousands and thousands upon thousands of locations. So just going to read some of these locations. Okay, so again, these are in order of most recent. So one of the things I want you to know as well is this has a 4-star review. So historically has done fairly well for itself, right? And now I want you to take that into account and look at the ratio of new reviews. So would you say the last 5 reviews have averaged 4 stars? If that's the case, you might have like 4 5 stars, maybe 3 5 stars, 1 4-star, and 1 1-star review, and that will probably average about 4 stars there. So if we look at this sort of review, you'll see, okay, so first one is a 1-star review, and that was only 2 weeks ago, and yeah, it doesn't have a lot of depth to it, so I'm gonna skip that one for now. Okay, so again, 1-star review, another 1-star review, and look, these are all within a month. So that's 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, another month ago. Okay, 5-star review, 5-star review, 5-star review, 5-star review. Nice. Again, these are all within the last month, and that's 7 months ago. Again, 1-star review. So like, whilst you did have half the reviews, so we've just looked at about 8 reviews there, right? So half the reviews were 5-star reviews, which are fine. That's good. But the issue here is that now the ratio isn't a 4-star review anymore. It's half the reviews are 5-star reviews, half the reviews are 1-star reviews. And if you look at just the last month alone, that ratio has even worsened. And I'm picking one location. I'm not cherry picking. I won't go that far, but this is just one location. You might say, well, David, this could just be one location, but frankly, I've looked at a few others and doesn't seem to be the case, particularly when you look at the newest reviews. I'm not saying that historically they haven't been well managed, I'm just saying recently they haven't. And you'll see that a lot of these are stemming from similar issues. So there's one major issue here, which is in terms of scheduling. So they've had a scheduling. So again, this is more like how well run the dentist is as well. So basically the customer's been told he's been scheduled there. He went to check in, and no one and basically said nope, he wasn't scheduled on it, which is never great, right? You've just wasted all that time. Didn't offer him any sort of compensation, any sort of alternative that's practical, potentially try and squeeze him in somewhere. Okay. Again, this is another one, their billing system. So this seems to be like their scheduling system, their billing system. So again, they've been scheduled. Here we go, routine checkup, covered within their insurance, and now they've been billed for it. This is what really, really gets me here. 7 months later, this customer is still having the same issue. That is horrible. If we look at sort of some other reviews as well, here we go. Again, this is their billing system. Now, I'm not going to go too far into these ones because these are old reviews, but there were also other reviews talking about how basically some of the dentists were newer, which actually lines up. If I go through some of that, I'm not going to dig through the whole presentation now because I don't want to get into that, but in the presentation, they do mention part of their key strategy is basically sell out. So what they do is they buy basically a 60% ownership in these dentists. The dentists themselves, it keeps like the 40% so they can get a payout later on. They perhaps stay on it like a lighter schedule. And then what ends up happening is they basically hire a bunch of new dentists to try and take that role. But the issue is that oftentimes these dentists are very inexperienced because they're fresh out of school, basically. And frankly, the service just isn't as good. And this also seems to be on the same thing on the fulfillment side as well. I've seen reviews talking about how they just wouldn't. Someone's made a mess of their filling. You're always going to get some of these type of reviews dentists, so I'm not too concerned. But what my concern is how it's devolved over time. It's the pattern, how it's gone from we're going to average 5 stars, 4 stars reviews, and it's just sort of been worsening over time. mean, just based on sort of recent reviews, I wouldn't be surprised if, if on a normalized basis it turns out to like a 2.5, 3-star review average. And that's sort of what I mean by, well, why is their retention falling? Why are they masking it? And I think fundamentally these are the issues behind the scenes that they're masking, and sort of, to me, is another sort of data point just confirming what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking here. Again, there is nothing sort of exact set in writing. And again, I'm not saying that this can't be an opportunity to make money, because frankly, anything trading at 5 times earnings, as long as it doesn't go bankrupt, will probably offer you some level of upside. Again, that's not advice, but just generally sort of comparing to historic market averages, right? They're pretty much the main points I wanted to make on this business. And ultimately, I think if you're able to sort of pick out these details, particularly if you just had to take one thing away, I think it'd just be reading these footnotes, because they are the most valuable. The amount of times I've seen, for example, one time there was just this one little footnote that basically said that there's 2 types of different classes of shares, and one has 1 vote per share and the other has 1,000 votes per share. Effectively, it meant that there was no internal management controls, and the owner of this business had just been diluting the heck out of shareholders, for them to shareholders just to basically get wiped out. Once they've been wiped out and no longer believe in the business for obvious reasons that are borderline fraudulent, the guy just goes and buys 1/4 of the business for himself, and then automatically starts buying back shares, as if he starts caring about capital allocation. Now, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to name that particular business. It's a Greek shipping business, but I'm not actually going to name it. But these are sort of the key points I wanted to make in this video. Just sort of some of the stuff I come across. So even though this is a very cheap opportunity on the surface, and frankly I wouldn't be surprised if if I see it double or even triple potentially over the next 2 years even. Because it is at a cheap multiple, and they probably could still keep growing, but it's just, do I want to hold a business of that quality, particularly when I know it's not as well run, and they do seem to have more fundamental issues in terms of billing, in terms of service, particularly the drop off in service and the fact that they're masking numbers. I really don't like businesses which their management team sort of mask the numbers, intentionally manipulate it, particularly to such a high level as well, because that to me is very dangerous. Because what else is there that I might have not missed? Because ultimately I'm not the day-to-day manager, and I am not going to know all the information. If I'm trying to compete against management to sort of reverse engineer, okay, have they masked this, but is it still good on that basis? It's just not something I want to be playing. So for me, it's a pass on that basis, and I'm not investing in this business. But again, if you would be interested in it, still knowing that, then fair enough too, if that's an opportunity you want to pursue, but not something for me. I just think there's tens of thousands of businesses out there, so I'm not going to be picking this one in particular. What I would say as well is, if you've got any general sort of queries, let me know. Yeah, I will be also attaching that spreadsheet at the bottom, so you can just literally go through all like 68 locations. I think it'll also be sort of a good exercise just to sort of get general understanding. Yeah, let me know any questions you have, any sort of counterpoints you have as well. I'd be really interested to hear as well, to get different perspectives. I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to be releasing a few more videos coming shortly. One, I probably will be talking about a different sort of compounder that ultimately I'm going to be investing into at some point, and then sort of go partly behind the rationale on that, and why it makes sense for me. But yeah, that's everything for today's video. Let me know what you think. Thank you.